which stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer. LGBTQ history from an abolitionist perspective. And I'm going to be talking about specific issues that LGBTQ people who are incarcerated in America today face. And at the end, I'm also going to be talking a little bit about some local LGBTQ abolitionist organizations in Chicago, if you're interested in getting more involved with these issues. And there will be, I believe, time at the end for discussion and questions, and I'm also leaving a little bit of time for that closer to the beginning as well. But of course, if you have any questions or comments at any point, please feel free to speak up. So before I start, I just wanted to clarify some terminology I'll be using for people who aren't as familiar with LGBTQ issues. And so the chart on the right breaks down 3 aspects of someone's gender identity and sexual identity. And so the first one, sex, refers to internal and external biological characteristics, such as genitals or chromosomes that society associates with being male or female or intersex. Gender refers to your personal sense of being a man, a woman, or non-binary, which can mean both, neither, or something completely separate from man and woman. Gender expression is a little bit different from gender identity. Gender expression refers to the way you express your gender identity through behavior, mannerisms, and appearances. And then the last one, sexuality, just refers to who you are sexually attracted to. And so I think it's helpful to think of each of these aspects of identity as a spectrum and also as socially constructed. And also each of these aspects is separate and not necessarily affecting each other. And what I mean by that is, like, even if you identify as transgender, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're gay or straight or bisexual. And even if you have a certain gender expression, that doesn't necessarily mean you have a certain gender identity or sexuality. And then on the left, I also just listed a few common terms that I'll also be using. Queer, transgender refers to just identifying as a gender different from the one assigned to you at birth. And then cisgender is essentially the opposite. It just means that you identify as the gender you were assigned at birth. Gender nonconforming means behavior or appearance that does not conform to social expectations of the gender you were assigned at birth. And queer is more of an umbrella term, and it typically just means other than straight. And finally, non-binary typically means identifying as neither male nor female, and usually people who are non-binary use they, them pronouns. And I also just wanted to emphasize that queer and non-binary are pretty subjective terms, and different people may have slightly different definitions of what exactly these terms mean to them. So before I go on, are there any questions or comments about this, or any other terms you've heard of that you wanted clarification on? Okay, and again, if I use a term that you don't know, definitely please feel free to ask about it. So moving on, so I am an abolitionist, and I'm going to be approaching this presentation from an abolitionist perspective. The well-known abolitionist Ruth Wilson Gilmore defines abolition as not just the closing of police departments, prisons, jails, and detention centers, but the presence instead of vital systems of support that many communities lack. And so I think it's important to understand some history of LGBTQ rights as we understand its intersection also with incarceration. And so one of the biggest examples is the Stonewall riots, which were a series of demonstrations by members of the LGBT community against violent police raids that were occurring at the Stonewall Inn, which was a gay bar in New York City in the summer of 1969. And at that time, being gay and wearing clothing of the opposite gender was still considered a crime. And so police would raid gay bars and violently arrest anyone that they could. And so the Stonewall riots were explicitly a protest against police violence that was being enacted on LGBTQ people, and specifically people of color, drag queens, and trans women. And the riots were predominantly led by Black and brown trans women, and many of whom were homeless and low income and sex workers. Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson were two prominent leaders of the Stonewall riots. They were both drag queens as well as trans women of color. In the 1970s, after the Stonewall riots, they actually went on to found the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, also known as STAR, which was an activist organization that provided support, resources, and housing to young drag queens and trans women on the streets of New York City. And the picture on the bottom left shows Marsha P. Johnson on the left and Sylvia Rivera on the right during a march in New York City. And the artwork on the right is by Micah Bazant, and it is an illustration of Marsha P. Johnson, along with some words about her legacy. And so, as this history shows, the modern LGBTQ movement is really inextricably tied to a history of particularly Black and brown trans women, and particularly those who were low income and sex workers being incarcerated and facing violence from police, and at the same time, fighting back against these very institutions and creating community resources for other LGBTQ people in need. And before I move on, I just wanted to open it up for discussion if people are feeling that, just to talk a little bit about like representation today and the sort of mainstream co-option of some LGBTQ movements today. And a couple examples are Governor Pritzker tweeted Black Trans Lives Matter in June, but he doesn't support defunding the police or closing prisons in Illinois. And another example is the Netflix documentary, The Life and Death of Marsha P. Johnson, which came out in 2017. And it was made by a white cisgender gay man. And it was later discovered that he actually stole a lot of the material for the film from a Black woman who was doing research on Marsha P. Johnson's life since the 90s. And so I just wanted to see if people had thoughts on, is this type of representation and sort of raising awareness enough, even if there's no substantial action behind it? And so who does this type of representation help and who does it leave behind? And obviously there's no right or wrong answer. And we can spend as much or as little time on this as people want to.
I think about how, I'm Gabi, also, I kept coming in. You guys hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So I think about how my mom has worked in Boys Town my whole life, so I spend a lot of time there. Mm-hmm. And it's really close to Uptown. And so I think about how Pride is like, there's always police presence at Pride. And I just think that, like, I don't know, I like, but just like how violent is, like, I don't know, I do see a lot of, like, obviously we know Boys Town is very like white, cis, gay male, like community, not so much like very inclusive of like all queer people. But I find people in Boys Town that like they feel safe with the police. It's like they like want them there. But I'm just thinking about the history of Pride, which is Stonewall, and which was a riot against the police. So I just think about like how the police now are part of Pride. And I know in Chicago, I don't know if that's the case everywhere else, but yeah. know, that was long-winded, but
Yeah, no, definitely. Thank you. And I will be talking a little bit more about like police presence and tribe a little bit later as well. Does anyone else have any thoughts or responses to that?
I feel like, sorry, Corey, go ahead. Go ahead, Corey.
No, I haven't seen the film, but just to speak on like bringing attention with Netflix films, I think it's just like a super minor component. Like they're good if they're done right, and it's good to spread information and get people aware, but it should not by any means be the end. It should be like the very first stepping stone, if anything, and it needs to be followed by a huge presence when they do come out to make them have an effect.
Definitely, yeah. Thank you.
I feel like two thoughts that, you know, from what you said, Corey, and what you said, Gabi, from what you said, Gabi, about like having police at Pride and how like completely messed up that really is. And like I live in basically the north side of Lakeview, and so like the north side of like where Boys Town is. And so when I would go to the CAPS meetings, the like police alternative whatever, there would be like a whole bunch of these old white dudes that like live in Boys Town that are basically like, we need more police presence because the clubs are like too rowdy and there's like people that get robbed and stuff. And I'm like, you have no idea where you live right now. Like you have no idea the community that you are living in and deciding to bring police into. And then, you know, what you said, Corey, about like, and these like Netflix documentaries, like Amazon has a documentary about like democracy, like All In for Democracy, which is the most fucked thing I've ever, I'm sorry for folks that are on the call with us, this is public training. But like Amazon talking about democracy, I'm like, it's just some things that are just like, it just seems wild if you don't actually think about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Alex.
And I was also going to say, kind of piggybacking off of what Corey said, when it does come to like representation today, one thing I have noticed, like with the show Pose, it literally like help people like see like life from their lens on a more emotional level, and like, you know how people treat people that's a part of the LGBTQ community, they treat us like, you know, we're not human. And Pose, in a sense, like when you look at like what the older generation said when they watched it, it kind of like it brought them they pretty much like gave us humanity to them. Like they actually have like feelings and lives and things really affect them. So I feel like that's like a really good thing. And then how they pretty much like represented the, you know, the Black and Latina community who pretty much started like drag culture. So it was like it pretty much like helped bring perspective and understanding to like people experiences. But I feel like it's not enough still, mainly because there's still discriminations no matter what. Like there's still a lot going on. There's still like so many setbacks. Like there's people who want to stop like gay marriage and stuff like that. It's still people who don't want to work with trans, non-binary, gay people. It's like, it's a lot of things that's still like happening behind the scenes, but the media makes it seem like it's all inclusive and like everyone is, we're moving forward and this is the past, and it's not, because there's still so many like places and cities and towns and things that we have to vote for that still needs to be happen.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much. Anyone else before I move on? And there will, of course, be more time for discussion at the end as well. Okay, so I'm going to move on, but again, please feel free to ask any questions as I'm going through the rest of the presentation. So now I'm going to be talking about some specific issues that LGBTQ people who are incarcerated face. I will be talking about violence and sexual assault, so if this is triggering for you, please do whatever you need to take care of yourself. And so I just wanted to mention a few things before I continue. First, all of the violence committed against LGBTQ people while incarcerated is disproportionately committed against Black and Brown people because of the racism that the prison industrial complex was founded on in America. Secondly, the Department of Corrections doesn't formally keep track of LGBTQ people in their facilities. And so information about these issues comes from outside organizations or really just anecdotally. And so these issues are obviously very underreported. And third, the vast majority of people incarcerated in the United States are in state prisons rather than federal prisons or county jails. And so legislation around incarceration is often most effective on the state level. And at the same time, legislation about incarceration can vary widely by state. When I'm talking about specific states, I am mostly going to be talking about Illinois, just because that's where most of my research has been. And then lastly, so neither the country as a whole nor the state of Illinois have laws protecting incarcerated LGBTQ people specifically. And this complete lack of guidelines really allows specifically the Illinois Department of Corrections to arbitrarily enforce or ignore procedures regarding LGBTQ people in their facilities. One example is during the intake process, LGBTQ people are more likely to be unfairly and incorrectly classified as sex offenders due to their sexual orientation, even if their sexual encounters have been consensual. And so now I'm going to be talking about three main issues that LGBTQ people face while they're incarcerated: assault and violence, housing in terms of solitary confinement, and healthcare access specifically for transgender people who are incarcerated. So LGBTQ people are more likely to experience verbal, physical, and sexual assault while they're incarcerated from both correctional officers and other incarcerated people because of homophobia, transphobia, and also racism. A survey conducted by Lambda Legal a few years ago found that 7% of LGBTQ incarcerated people experienced sexual assault, 12% experienced physical assault, 27% experienced sexual harassment, and 57% experienced verbal assaults or harassment from prison or jail staff. Of those who experienced assault by staff, 30% reported the incident, but only 2% of those who reported it felt that their complaint was fully addressed. And also, in order to fully understand assault in prison, it's important to know about the Prison Rape Elimination Act, which is also known as PREA. And PREA is federal legislation that was signed into law by President Bush in 2003 after a 2001 report by Human Rights Watch on rape in male prisons in America. And PREA addresses how facilities deal with preventing and detecting and responding to sexual abuse. However, individual states still have the authority to decide what specific measures they put in place to uphold PREA in state prisons. And there was actually bipartisan support for this bill when it was passed. I believe it was actually passed unanimously, but it contains nothing about specifically LGBTQ protections. And just a side note, at Stateville Correctional Center in Joliet in Illinois, the PREA hotline is actually painted pretty frequently on the walls of the hallways. And I will talk a little bit more about the implications of PREA a little bit later on. And so because LGBTQ people are more likely to experience verbal, physical, and sexual abuse from correctional officers and other incarcerated people, they are often put in solitary confinement. And this housing option is seen by prison and jail staff as protective custody, but it's without the choice of the person involved. And this practice happens in both men's and women's facilities. Solitary confinement for more than 15 days is actually considered to be torture by the United Nations. And people in solitary are in individual cells for 23 or 24 hours a day. They can't participate in educational or vocational programming offered at the facility. They can't work, and they can't receive visitors. Sometimes there may be an informal quote unquote homosexual wing for openly gay, bisexual, or queer incarcerated people. But again, this is very informal and it really depends on the facility. And also, again, there's no formal opportunity for people to self-identify or to sort of request this option. But at the same time, transgender and gender nonconforming people will more likely be put into solitary confinement rather than some sort of homosexual wing because of their gender expression. The book 6 by 10 is a compilation of essays written by people who have experienced solitary, their family members and loved ones, and also correctional officers who worked in solitary. And it really shows the immense harm that solitary confinement causes on people who experience it and also those around them. And one of the essays in this book is written by a Latina trans woman who was incarcerated in several men's prisons in Texas and was put in solitary for almost a year, again, for her own protection, but which was a decision that she had no say in. So I would definitely recommend reading this book if you're interested in learning more about the effects of solitary confinement. And also, I just wanted to note that Black in Pink is a national LGBTQ abolitionist organization with a Chicago chapter that's very active. And they actually have a Stop Solitary campaign, which I will talk more about at the end of this presentation. But the picture on the right is from the cover of one of their Stop Solitary zines. And so now I'm going to be talking about healthcare access in jails and prisons, specifically for incarcerated transgender people, not necessarily for gay, lesbian, and bisexual people. And so hormones and surgery are routinely denied to transgender people in prison. They aren't seen as essential medical care, which is often the case in the outside world as well. And so I just wanted to take a minute to explain sort of what trans healthcare entails. In terms of hormones, trans men typically take testosterone injections. Trans women typically take a combination of estrogen pills and testosterone blockers. And this is called hormone replacement therapy, which is also known as HRT. And it alters things like body hair growth, muscle and fat distribution, skin texture, metabolism, and mood, among other things. And trans people, once they start taking hormones, typically are on hormones for the rest of their lives. And some of the changes from hormone replacement therapy are permanent, but others will actually regress if the hormones are stopped. And so it can really be emotionally and even physically harmful if HRT is abruptly stopped, which is often what happens when trans people are admitted to the facility. And then in terms of surgery, I just want to emphasize that there is no single, trans surgery. There are actually several different types. And to name just some of the more common ones, There are genital surgeries for trans men and women. There are different forms of chest surgeries, usually mastectomies for trans men or breast implants for trans women. There are facial and vocal cord alteration surgeries, usually just for trans women. And then there are also torso masculinization and feminization surgeries. And all of these different types of surgeries are seen by cisgender people with varying degrees of being essential. And some trans people choose to get multiple surgeries, some get only one or two, and some decide not to get any. And this decision is, of course, completely up to the individual, their needs, their feelings, and their resources. And it's also important to realize that homosexuality was only removed from the category of mental illnesses from the DSM in 1973. And gender dysphoria, which is what a lot of trans people experience, was only removed from the classification of sexual disorders in the DSM in 2013. Some insurance companies still don't cover the cost of gender-affirming hormones or surgeries for trans people on the outside. And so there's not a great precedent here in terms of trans healthcare being seen as essential. Sometimes a facility may have an unofficial, sometimes called a transgender committee, of completely unqualified staff members that make decisions on whether or not trans people in their facilities should receive gender dysphoria treatment. But again, information about these committees is very anecdotal, and again, it's not officially reported by the Department of Corrections. And I also just wanted to note that healthcare in prison is really abysmal for anyone, and healthcare is also often more difficult to access while in solitary confinement. And so, for example, the Illinois Department of Corrections has a contract with Wexford Health Services, which is a private healthcare company. And Wexford is paid in advance for their services, so they really have no incentive to provide actual care. And this article is referring to Wexford's claim that they could deny people surgery on both eyes because you only need one eye to see. And so a class action lawsuit was filed against the Illinois Department of Corrections in 2012 to address this. And the Department of Corrections promised to reform its contract with Wexford in 2019, but the Department of Corrections' complete mishandling of COVID, for example, shows that healthcare in prison is really still just violently inadequate. And so it's important to understand this in order to understand that trans people in prison face the double challenge of their healthcare not being seen as essential even on the outside, and at the same time, healthcare for anyone being prohibitively difficult to access while incarcerated. So Strawberry Hampton is a Black trans woman who was incarcerated in the Illinois Department of Corrections. She later became the client of the Uptown People's Law Center in Chicago. She was moved around 4 different men's prisons in Illinois, and most of her time was spent in solitary confinement. She also experienced abuse from correctional officers and other incarcerated people. And she was eventually moved to Logan Correctional Center, which is a women's prison in Illinois, in December of 2018. And she was released in July of 2019, a date which should have been almost a year earlier, but because she spent so much time in solitary confinement, she couldn't participate in programs that would have allowed her release to be earlier. And she was actually rearrested in November, which she claims was retaliation for reporting her abuse. Another facet of this is in October of 2019, a private Facebook group was discovered by Injustice Watch, where Illinois correctional officers were posting pictures of Strawberry Hampton and other trans women who were incarcerated in the Illinois Department of Corrections, and they were demeaning their appearance and posting transphobic slurs. And so in December of 2019, a federal judge ruled on behalf of 5 trans women who were suing IDOC and being represented by the ACLU. And the judge ruled that IDOC must overhaul its transgender policies. And this would include providing sensitivity training to staff, providing trans people with necessary healthcare, and stopping the policy of using a transgender committee of completely unqualified staff members that make decisions on whether or not trans people should receive gender dysphoria treatment. And IDOC actually had until the end of January to give the court an update on their decisions, but there hasn't been any publicly released information on whether or not this ever actually happened. And so now I'm going to be talking a little bit about my experience and work through the Inside Out program at DePaul, specifically in relation to LGBTQ people who are incarcerated. And just a little bit of background, the Inside Out Prison Exchange program is a now international program that was started at Temple University in Philadelphia in 1997. And Inside Out classes are half inside incarcerated students and half outside students who are attending the college or university. And almost always all the students in the class get class credit from the university. And DePaul is one of 2 universities in Illinois that has an Inside Out program. And so I was in Dr. Christina Rivers' Law, Politics, and Mass Incarceration class in the spring of 2018. And our final group project in Dr. Rivers' class was to write a bill about some aspect of incarceration in Illinois. And so my group decided to write a bill that would extend protections for LGBTQ people who are incarcerated in Illinois. And pre-COVID, Dr. Rivers held monthly think tanks at Stateville. And so we had been developing the bill with people from our group and other people at Stateville and DePaul and Chicago since then. And the bill itself essentially extends protections that are already granted to everyone under the Prison Rape Elimination Act to specifically protect LGBTQ incarcerated people. And last year we were planning on proposing it in the 2021 legislative session, but that date has now been pushed back because of COVID restrictions, obviously. I'm also happy to share the text of this bill with anyone if you want to message me or talk to me afterwards as well. And so the bill was divided into 8 main sections, which I'll just briefly describe here. The IDOC intake and identification procedure refers to informing IDOC of how to implement a system that assesses the risk of incoming people without discrimination or making assumptions about their preferences. Classification, placement, and risk assessments refers to informing IDOC and its staff on how to classify LGBTQ people and assess their risk based on medical staff evaluations so that the proper housing placement can be made. Segregation placement refers to eliminating solitary confinement as an acceptable housing option for LGBTQ people just because IDOC does not know where to house them. Medical and mental health care services refers to addressing the necessary medical care, which includes medication, mental health care, and potential surgeries required for transgender incarcerated people. Safety and privacy rights for transgender incarcerated people refers to informing IDOC staff on how to protect LGBTQ people in regards to their privacy and personal space, which include showering, housing, pat-downs, and strip searches. Staff and volunteer LGBTQ sensitivity and communications training requirements refers to informing IDOC staff of what type of training and education they're required to participate in order to effectively protect LGBTQ people. Clothing, hairstyle, grooming, and hygiene refers to providing information on the types of resources and items that should be available to LGBTQ incarcerated people and how they have the right to dress and groom in a way that makes them feel comfortable. And finally, access to educational and rehabilitative programs refers to making sure that LGBTQ people are not denied the right to further their education based on their orientation. And also an additional part of our bill was a list of questions and answers that were gathered from LGBTQ people at Stateville Correctional Center last year by my friend Lonnie, who has been helping us work on this project. And Lonnie was involved in Dr. Rivers' think tanks, and he helped to work on the bill with us. And before I go through these briefly, I just wanted to note that there aren't a lot of openly LGBTQ people at Stateville, partly because it's a maximum security facility and most of the people there have very long-term sentences. And the only openly LGBTQ people that are incarcerated there do live separately in an informal homosexual wing, and they don't interact a lot with the general population. And so now I'm going to go through just a couple of the questions and answers. I added the red underlines just to emphasize specific sections, and I won't read off everything, but again, the full Q&A is also included in the document of the bill, which again, I'm happy to share with people. And also just another content warning for discussions of violence and sexual assault. So why are LGBTQ rights and safety important in prison? Their rights and safety are important because it sets equal medical standardized treatment, establishes humane, properly proportioned housing arrangements, which more so will provide normalcy in an already difficult environment, especially for open members of the LGBT community. How do incarcerated LGBTQ citizens not share equal rights with others inside prison? LGBTQ members are often involuntarily housed in protective custody, prevented access to prison legal services, and cross-gender pat-downs and strip searches are non-existent. How do incarcerated LGBTQ citizens experience discrimination regarding healthcare in prison? LGBTQ members, specifically transgender prisoners, are not provided hormone replacement therapy till after a GID, which means gender identity disorder, committee approves them, whom I may add has been found neither competent nor qualified to make decisions. What type of abuse are LGBTQ incarcerated citizens subjected to? Most members of the LGBT community are unjustly housed in segregation under investigation status up to 30 days at officials' discretion. And so at this point, I want to come back to addressing solutions to LGBTQ rights issues from an abolitionist perspective and talk a little bit about the ineffectiveness and sometimes even harmful effects of a lot of recent reform efforts. An example of this reformist legislation is hate crime legislation, which increases prison sentences for people who have been found guilty of attacking or killing an LGBTQ person because of their identity. And implementation of this type of legislation often involves a lot of collaboration with law enforcement, including giving them more resources. And this type of legislation really does virtually nothing to actually address the causes of violence against LGBTQ people or to help them heal from this violence. And another example, which is one we kind of talked about earlier, is putting rainbows on cop cars and having police departments walk in pride parades. And again, this not only completely overlooks the history of police violence against LGBTQ people, particularly low-income Black and brown trans women, but it also, again, does virtually nothing to actually advance LGBTQ rights and causes. And so overall, any reform effort that actually gives more resources to the prison industrial complex, regardless of its intentions to help LGBTQ people, is ultimately going to perpetuate more harm and move us further away from abolition. And on the left, Captive Genders is a compilation of essays about the incarceration of trans and gender non-conforming people, specifically in jails, prisons, and detention centers in America. It was also on No Name's Book Club in July. And the first essay in this book really breaks down specific reform efforts and how they really fail to address the root causes that they're trying to fix. So I would definitely also recommend reading this book if you're interested in learning more about what I've been talking about today. And so for as much effort put into improving the conditions of trans and queer people who are incarcerated, just as much effort should be put into getting trans and queer people and all people out of prisons and jails and detention centers, and at the same time, creating communities where police and prisons are obsolete. And so again, this is about thinking with an abolitionist mindset, which again, as Ruth Wilson Gilmore describes, as not just shutting down police departments, prisons, jails, and detention centers, but really creating communities where these institutions are obsolete. And so, yes, trans and queer people are more likely to experience violence in prison, but prisons themselves are inherently violent places. And so we don't just want to get trans and queer people out of solitary confinement, we want to get everyone out. And we don't just want trans people to get necessary health care. Everyone deserves health care in prison and also out of prison. And so some examples of abolitionist work include, reentry resources for people coming out of prison and jail, mutual aid, reparations, accessible healthcare and education, and of course, dismantling white supremacy, cis heteropatriarchy, and capitalism. And so to wrap things up, I just wanted to briefly talk about a few local Chicago organizations that do work around LGBTQ people who are impacted by incarceration. So I would encourage you to follow them on social media or get involved with their outreach. And also, this is, of course, by no means an extensive list. So the Transformative Justice Law Project offers free legal services to low-income trans people. They distribute educational materials and resources for people who are incarcerated. And they also do monthly name change mobilizations for trans people who live in Cook County. The Uptown People's Law Center represented Strawberry Hampton, and they also do a lot of class action lawsuits and individual cases for people who are incarcerated to improve the conditions, and also specifically working with people who are incarcerated who are impacted by the prison healthcare system. Brave Space Alliance is a Black trans-led LGBTQ center on the south side of Chicago. And they do support groups, a lot of mutual aid programs, they do trainings, and they're very involved in community organizing in Chicago. And finally, Black and Pink is a national organization with a very active Chicago chapter. And they have a lot of reentry programs and support. And the Chicago chapter also has a Stop Solitary campaign, which I also mentioned earlier. And they do weekly mail processing of all the letters they get from incarcerated people. And also they have a very active pen pal matching program. And so with this program, you can match yourself with an LGBTQ person who was incarcerated. And pre-COVID, Black and Pink would hold monthly pen pal matchings and orientations in person. But now you can actually review their pen pal guidelines on your own and match yourself with an LGBTQ pen pal all online. And so I wrote their website at the bottom. And I personally think that writing to a pen pal in prison, especially someone who identifies as LGBTQ, is a really great and accessible way to build connections and solidarity with incarcerated community members. So now I just wanted to open things up for discussion, questions, and comments. I've written down a few discussion questions, but obviously feel free to just talk about anything that stuck out to you or just any general questions or comments that you have.
I had a question about the bill you were working on.
Mm-hmm.
I had a question about the bill that you guys are working on.
Yeah.
Or like the judge to ask the defendant what they identify as prior to being sentenced.
I'm sorry, could you repeat? I didn't hear the beginning of what you said, sorry.
No problem. Is there anything in there that requires the judge maybe to ask the defendant how they identify prior to them being sentenced?
I believe that the majority of what we were writing about was about specifically like people who are already in prison or jail, and not as much about the judicial system.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Anyone else?
I just wanted to say thank you for the presentation. I know that like some of these conversations can be like a little awkward, or you don't know how to like present someone with a question. Like I know two trans males, and you know, so, like you don't want to like question them, right? But it's also like about like just learning and you know, not being like awkward about it, I guess you can say. But I definitely learned a lot from this presentation, so thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, I also put my email at the bottom. If anyone wants to reach out, I'm happy to talk or answer questions privately. And you can also message me on my Instagram, which I believe was like tagged in the Chicago Votes post about this on their social media. So I'm also happy to talk privately to anyone.
I'll say I believe like after like listening to the presentation and like pretty much like applying everything to like what I like see going on in the world, I wonder like how many, well, if most of the trans people that are incarcerated are wrongfully incarcerated. And it just had me thinking, because they do experience a lot of abuse or people trying to kill them for who they are. And I wonder if most of their cases are self-defense cases instead of like some other stuff that other people get incarcerated with. But it just made me think, like, are most of these people experiencing like wrongfully incarceration?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's really important to think about. And also thinking about the intersection with like the decriminalization of sex work, especially because there's definitely a big overlap of low-income trans people involved in sex work as well. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up.
Yes, I also would like to say thank you, James. This was amazing. I feel like a little bit of a big sister for some people who don't know. Like James and I were in that law and politics class with Rivers together, and then he TA'd for the Inside Out program the year after me. So I'm like, this is so exciting. You're like the lead. I'm sorry, we're recording. I have to be serious. I love this question that you have, though, about why is there such an emphasis on reform over abolition? And I really appreciate that you approach this entire presentation with your abolitionist perspective, because there is like, I don't really think that I put so much energy into really even acknowledging that, but that's so true. That there is so much emphasis on, I mean, obviously, like there's a lot of arguments against prison abolition in general, but there's so much emphasis on LGBTQ reform in so many different senses in general. And it's like, the why is not the question that I'm often engaging with. Like, why are people always pushing for reform? And it's so tied to anti-Blackness and homophobia that people just simply do not want to address that this is a population of people who have rights. And they want to further silence that. So I don't know, that question just kind of tweaked me a little bit, but it's so important, and I appreciate you putting it in there.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, another big sort of reform movement is like legalizing same-sex marriage, which the book Captive Genders talks a lot about, and how it's at the time is seen as sort of a solution to a lot of issues that LGBTQ people were facing, but how it is very much catered towards, you know, white, cisgender, gay men, and how gay marriage itself and same-sex marriage itself doesn't really address a lot of issues that LGBTQ people are facing, particularly those who are low income and particularly people of color. So yeah, I think that's definitely really important to think about. Yeah, thank you.
I think that for me, folks don't ever connect reforms over like understanding the difference between reform and abolition because they don't understand the root causes of the movements that we have today. So that's why I really appreciate like, all right, so like, let's be clear, the modern like LGBTQ movement that we're talking about, we always reference Stonewall, was literally people protesting against police. Like, can we go back to this root cause? Like the police, the whole point of the police is they are an extension of the state and the state's will. And like the state doesn't care about us, and the state actively has rules and laws put in place. And you named a few of them, 1973 and 2013 to be specific, of like, this is when like the law stopped like criminalizing our identities, period. And so the fact that this whole movement against oppression of LGBTQ people, it all has to do with like our current government and laws. It's like, yes, it's between individual people because that's how it manifests in a lot of people's lives. It's like people's family, friends, communities acting out against them, but there are systems in place that are manifesting these habits and reaffirming these ideas. And I think that's really where, at least I'm a member of the LGBT community, this is where our community gets lost, is we forget what this movement is about. And we forget that like this started because the police literally would come into our safe spaces and make us unsafe. So like why it boggles my mind too, Kia. It makes me really angry. And I after like going to other LGBTQ events during Pride that affirm my identities, like I see it differently. And like Chicago Votes goes to Chicago Pride to register voters because that's where everybody be at. But like, let me tell you, there's a lot of thought that goes into like, how do we protect our people while we're there? Because like people don't, like young people of color don't feel safe there. And that's just the proof. And that's just like the facts of it.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much.
Hey, James. Thank you so much for everything. Just thinking about our American legal system as a whole and like going or like furthering Rudy's comments around how like there's no justice for people in this community to begin with. And on the flip side of that, thinking about like the protection of people and how our state and our system doesn't even protect or have systems in place to really protect this community. I'm thinking of like this past week, and like this is something that happened that like had a little violence of Kendall Stevens in Pennsylvania, who was attacked by transphobic people in Pennsylvania. And in Pennsylvania, queer and trans people aren't seen as a protected class. And so the people who like went into her home and attacked her, they have a hearing, but how the current law is set up, that they can't even be charged with a misdemeanor or felony because of it. And so I'm like wondering, from a like abolitionist viewpoint, like what are your thoughts on having on like accountability in the system for protecting some of the most or the most vulnerable people in our community and our current system, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it's a really, really complicated and like messy question, you know, because the way that our legal system in America, like you said, is set up, it is not set up to give people actual justice, especially people who are marginalized. And so I think it's really important to think of justice and healing and protection, you know, outside of the legal system that we have. We just don't have a lot of resources and a lot of examples of that. And so it is just genuinely very hard to sort of imagine like different ways of justice and healing, for sure.
Thank you.
Also, to kind of piggyback off what Rudy was saying, I also think there's more emphasis on reform than abolition, mainly because um, the systems that's already in place. I mean, it's still is a lot of limitations that comes with reform. Still, there's not much change, and with the systems, it's still like implicate like racism and all that stuff. So it's like, yeah, these things can be reformed, but nothing truly changes for the people like at the bottom that continues to fight for it. I think what Gabi was saying, like particularly Boys Town, they have like, though they have this safe space and they feel protected with their police protection, but still there's people that's, you know, that's gay, that's black, or that's, you know, other people of color that still don't have that safe space. So it's like, yeah, it's reformed, these people have this, but who is it really for? It's not for everyone. It's just for this particular group of people. So that's why I believe reform is more emphasized than abolition, because abolition is when, okay, we're going to start over. We're going to make it all inclusive. Everyone is going to get what they deserve. There's not going to be any more racism and stuff like that. Boys Town isn't going to be just only for gay, cis, white men and stuff like that. So that's where that goes, where the emphasis on reform is the big thing everyone talks about now than abolition.
Yeah, definitely. And I think also a part of that is, you know, people who are part of the LGBT community, but who have a lot of privilege, really sometimes want to sort of cater to non-LGBTQ people as they're like pursuing rights. And so I think that's why there's a lot of emphasis on reform rather than abolition, just to yeah, sort of more cater to the mainstream legal system, and but at the same time that leaves like so many people in the LGBT community behind as well.
I also had some thoughts around that, and I think like after hearing like something I was particularly surprised but also not at the same time was when you talked about that like Facebook like page where like they're just posting a whole bunch of like messed up things on there. I think the more awareness that people get of all those things that are happening that are just so like fucked up, like there's no reforming that. And I think if more people had the information that they needed, then they would also realize that like it can't be reformed. Like we just gotta scrap this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like we are seeing that more and more every single day. So yeah, thank you.
James, what was the percentage that you gave us, folks that reported verbal abuse from correctional officers? Was it like over 50%, you said?
It was 57% experienced verbal assault or harassment from prison or jail staff. And of those who experienced it, 30% reported the incident, but only 2% of those who reported it felt that their complaint was fully addressed.
That is just wild to me. Like that is, like you would expect like, oh, of the folks who are also experiencing incarceration, like, you know, people are going to say shit to you, but the people who like the staff, this is coming from the staff. Like, are you, oh, that is so wild to me. That's just a very stark and shocking statistic that makes me want to throw up.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I want to shout out. Well, thank you so much. I feel like I feel obliged. I also need to thank you. This was super dope. I want to shout out Josh because he dragged me to an action back this summer where I got to actually see folks from Brave Space Alliance speak in person, which was super dope. And I immediately pulled out my phone and gave them my dollars because they deserve it. And that's what I'm reminded of when reading the last question: how can we address LGBTQ issues from an abolitionist mindset of like, what are the action steps we can take and what are the movements that are happening right now in Chicago that we can be a part of? So I just would love to hear, like, where would you send us? What campaigns should we plug into? Like, what's the next step for us now that we've been pissed off by this presentation?
Yeah, I mean, there really are so many, especially in Chicago. And I can just go back. These were the 4 that I just wanted to highlight. And I know Brave Space Alliance, particularly this summer especially, has been doing a lot more like mutual aid work specifically. And on their website and on their Instagram, they have different like donation sites where you can drop off like groceries, protest supplies, things like that. And they distribute them to like jail support, to different places around the city. So that's a very like accessible way to get involved. But again, there aren't that many like in-person things right now. But I would also recommend being matched with the pen pal with Black and Pink as well.
Have you done it before? Are you a pen pal matched human?
Yeah, yeah, I have a pen pal at Lawrence Correctional Center, and yeah, it's just a really great opportunity. And I also do work with Solidarity Letters, which is another pen pal program that was started by Becca, who I think is still here. I'm not sure, but.
Hi.
Yes, so that's another pen pal program, and it's not specifically for LGBTQ people, but I can also send people the Google form if they're interested in being matched that way as well.
Something really interesting. We had a training with Dr. Valerie Johnson about the civil rights movement, and I think it was Uriel that asked, like, is the movement, the Black Lives Matter movement now better than the civil rights movement was? Like, she had talked about some of the mistakes they had made, including being homophobic or sexist or having misogyny. As a part of like leadership. And so she was saying yes, because the Black Lives Matter movement now is way more gender inclusive, isn't homophobic. And I'm just wondering, do you feel the same way?
About the Black Lives Matter movement specifically?
And just like, yeah, the movement work happening now.
I guess that's kind of a hard question. I mean, I think they're just like, obviously just like very, very different times. But yeah, I think that like any sort of social cause, you know, has to be intersectional, of course. And like at the beginning, I was sort of talking about how prison abolition is an LGBTQ issue, and LGBTQ liberation must involve prison abolition. And so I think a lot of the time when people talk about like social movements, they're seen as like very separate causes, but in reality, they are, you know, extremely connected, and you know, advancing those causes isn't going to completely happen if you're not including and thinking about all of the other aspects that are also involved. So, yeah.
Another question, James.
Mhm.
So kind of just thinking about like how the violence against the LGBTQ community, specifically Black trans women, and thinking about like how that takes up a lot of conversation or a lot of space, and how people like speak about it overall. And I'm thinking about Kiera's point of like watching Pose, and also seeing like the amount of joy and artistry and like badass like people who are like living their life with like the like with the direction of like the hope that like they want the world to be.
Mhm.
And like with your thoughts, like what are some, who are some artists, like what are some um like movies, shows, drag performers, like outlets to like experience the side of this community in a way where like they're just like blasting how incredibly beautiful and like fucking awesome they are.
Um, I feel like I'm kind of blanking right now. But you know, of course, Pose is like an amazing show. And I think also just like really being involved in like local like Chicago drag scenes and stuff like that. And you know, really seeing things like in person, so that yeah, so that there's more of like a connection there. And yes, so yeah, seeing things that aren't just like on the screen also, I guess, is important. But yeah, I think I'm just like blanking on a lot of things right now, but that's a really good question. Yeah, thanks.
I don't have a question, but I just want to say thank you again for the presentation. I'm really happy to. This is the only presentation of I've been like blessed to have a lot of trainings or like history lessons and things like this, but none of them have been centered through like an abolitionist point of view, and they very much need to be. So I appreciate you like starting off on that note.
Thank you. Yeah.
And I think like your question around why is there such an emphasis on LGBTQ reforms rather than abolition? And I don't know if you want to keep sharing the screen, but
Oh,
it's like
yeah.
everybody, you can see folks. But I think like that question is so interesting because it's like, why do we talk about reforms rather than abolition in so many spaces? Like we talk about police reform rather than police abolition all the time. We talk about prison reform rather than abolition. I feel like it's because part of me feels like it's because it's easier for some folks, like it's less of a big step. And then I think for other folks, it's like just because in some stances it makes more sense, like, or it is like what can actually happen in reality.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, that's just like very much the framework that like most discourse about this like revolves around. And so it's hard for people to like think completely outside of that. It really is.
I also think, this is Becca, sorry if it's loud where I am, but Alex and I were talking the other day about just like how I just don't think that like most people have ever seen alternatives like at all, like presented to them, around them, or like work. And so like it's also like, you know, sometimes people who are like the most affected by police violence and incarceration are still very pro police and pro prison because they like literally, you know, we're still raised in a society where they like they believe that that's the only way to address harm, right? So like I don't know, I've just been thinking a lot about it recently. And of course, you know, James and Alex and I and other people have had these conversations of just like, we also as abolitionists, I just like, we need to figure out ways to continue to build community and address harm in alternative ways, right? I don't know, just something I've been thinking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you, Becca.
And Gabi, you said because the people most impacted are not in the room. Like,
or like leading the movement, I think specifically for like LGBTQ issues. I don't think in that specific, I could be wrong, like correct me if I am, but I feel like politically or in any type, I don't think there's a lot of like people of color or like trans people being represented. So I feel like it's easy to, you know, exclude them and just think about like easy wins that, you know, can help part of that community, like the cis, you know, community. But yeah, that's.
Yeah, definitely. And like the huge nonprofit human rights campaign, yeah, it's very much like that. It's just very like white and cisgender led, and they push for like very, you know, reformist policies. And they have like tons and tons of funding. But again, they're not actually like addressing a lot of the big issues that LGBTQ people are really facing. So.
And I'm gonna be spicy, okay? I'm not gonna say no names, but there are people of color who are a member of the LGBTQ community in power that do not share our values and aren't even open to hearing new forms of and new systems. Like it's just not even an option. I think it's very clear that it's not an option. And so until we get like our people in those places to be able to tear that down, like it's not gonna happen. And it's really annoying to see the folks from North Halstead just out here so excited to have Black and Latinx queer folks and trans folks in power across this nation, but we're not seeing the policies coming through down the pipeline. And I think that's a huge problem, and we're not saying nothing about it. And those people who love to be so loud are also not saying anything about it. It's just gross to me. It's crusty.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, it's very ridiculous.
I just wanted to comment on the, you know, I think it was said through Kia in this comment, and also Alex was just kind of saying like the contrarian to abolition about how it's like never been established, and how you know, people tend to want to like go to reformist practices, but you can see like the existence of the LGBTQ plus community as like abolitionist work, especially when you're talking about like the gender binary. Like that's not a thing that like what that was a very strong thing of like, hey, you know, you're either man, you're a woman. You know, there's this very strong binary that has been completely broken by the work of trans folk and radical movement. So I think that we have to kind of like break down this idea of, you know, this is something so like unimaginable when we like see it already in our lives.
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, thank you, Kia, for that comment too. I just saw that.
Yeah, Isaiah, you saying that makes me think of, I mentioned it a little bit in the comments, but after some of the protests this summer, there was the creation of the Chicago Black Drag Council, and some of the methods that they've been using are like very much rooted in abolition and community accountability, where they've been inviting establishments across Boys Town to have community, and basically like listing out all the issues, all the specific examples, and rather than like, and they're very adamant about like not participating in cancel culture, but like participating in community around like, listen, like I'm here for you and your growth to like hope for a day where like we can like live in solidarity with each other. But part of that process is like this accountability structure, and they've been very transparent about it, where they've like held these community meetings online. You can find them on YouTube, where they basically like put these places on blast to their faces, and it's it's beautiful to watch, not like in a VH1 like this is drama sort of way, but like in a way of like how they're just holding space for people that's like rooted in this thought of love and like imagination that like we can work through this. And they've recently started a podcast called The Black Tea, where they're kind of going through holding specific establishments accountable and talking through experiences and just holding this idea of transparency as a core belief, because like them doing this, like other cities have started to do it, like people are seeing what they're doing and they're starting to replicate it, and like really seeing this idea of abolition through this lens of like love and accountability. And so like shout out to like Chicago Black Drag Council for coming with that energy and showing us how to do that, but also be like putting it out there in like our world of social media and being like, yeah, no, everybody gets to see this because everybody was experiencing this and everybody was seeing it when it wasn't on social media and when it wasn't popular. So like, we're just gonna make this happen. So.
Amazing. Do other people have thoughts or questions or anything else that they want to share with James for all of this? Also, by the way, we were totally, before COVID, about to have a huge parade to polls and have a whole section with drag queens. We were so excited for it. It will happen in the future at some point, hopefully.
Yes.
Amazing. Well, James, do you have anything to leave us with today?
I did also put my email in the chat. It's a little bit further up now. Just again, if anyone wants to reach out again. But yeah, thank you guys so much for attending and for just like listening really thoughtfully today. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you.
Alrighty, everybody. Well, thank you again for coming. If you are a fellow, oh yeah, say thank you and give an applause.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, James.
Thanks, James.
Thank you. So if you're a fellow, you're just gonna hop on to our Friday Zoom after this. And if you're not, have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, y'all.